In preparation of 2017 as the International Year for Sustainable Tourism for Development, the World Tourism Organization has analyzed national strategies linking the tourist sector with the SDGs. The analysis found a focus upon 3 SDGs, namely decent work and economic growth, responsible consumption and production, and partnerships for the SDG goals. But the national agendas linking tourism with good health and well-being was almost absent. The World Tourist Organization also analyzed 60 large tourist companies from all parts of the tourist value chain to see if their planned corporate social responsibility activities responded to the global SDG agenda. As illustrated here, the companies had planned activities responding to most of the 17 SDGs. The majority of activities were linked with the SDG on responsible production and consumption, with SDG 6, clean water and sanitation, targeting more directly environmental health issues, was less well represented. The need for a comprehensive SDG agenda might be the greatest for the tropical islands such as Maldives, British Virgin Islands or Aruba, where tourism is a dominating economy. However, growing tourism in these environments does not automatically result in poverty reduction. Tourism development may even entrench existing inequalities. For example, where some local residents benefit from better jobs in the tourist industry, while the majority can hardly pay for the rising cost of living. Conflicts over scarce natural resources such as water may increase. Livelihoods based upon the marine ecosystem may suffer from an increase in sewage outflows from hotels. It has been argued that for the tourist industry to contribute significantly to the reduction of poverty, a broad approach that values social and environmental sustainability is needed. Governments need to establish an effective policy environment and play a stronger regulatory role. To get a broader understanding of the social and environmental impacts of tourism in low-income countries, I've called upon one of the world's leading researchers in the field, Professor Stefan Gößling. What would be some of the most important social and environmental impacts that tourists and tourism leaves behind in these kinds of destinations?
That very much depends on context, obviously, but essentially we always encounter the same problems. The first, obviously, is land use. When you want to attract tourism to a country, you will have to build hotels and infrastructure to make them stay. And usually these infrastructures have the character of resort hotels. That means they are embedded in larger areas where you have access to the sea, where you have swimming pools, where you have gardens, and where you have usually a more luxurious kind of tourism environment where tourists would like to spend their time. And just that combination could be problematic because very often beaches are exactly those locations that have not been of much interest for stakeholders earlier on. And now with the rise of tourism, these beaches become highly sought after. And since no beach in the world is not really used, there's usually conflicts with local people who might have been living in that area before. And then you also have different other impacts, such as the fact that in front of a beach you might have a mangrove forest, for instance, and that mangrove forest has to go, or you have a seagrass field that is disturbing the tourists and the perception of hotel managers, and then there might be dredging to get rid of the seagrass. So you can see there's direct impacts like that, but then you also have indirect impacts which might be related to the food that is sourced. Tourists usually want higher quality food, higher source of protein. There's much wastage, obviously, and also waste resulting out of that system. That can then increase pressure on species. For instance, if you have pelagic fish types that the tourists would rather want for food, then that can increase pressure on these species You have special types of food like hammer or lobsters, and then other crustaceans that might be very interesting to tourists and that can greatly enhance pressure on these. You have ornamental shells that might be sought after by tourists, and that can increase pressure on species. But you can also have different impacts, one thing I discovered at some point, which I found very intriguing, was the fact that the waste in terms of plastics and other items that were discarded by hotels in big piles would be a source of little puddles after heavy rains that then became breeding grounds for malaria-carrying mosquitoes. So you can have very different, very complex impacts arising out of tourism development.
How would all these social and environmental impacts, do you think, influence the viability of the tourist sector in some of these low-income destinations?
Well, the great paradigm is growth forever. It's what the UNWTO is trying to get into the heads of, in particular, leaders in developing countries, that they should focus on tourism. And to some degree, that makes sense because tourism is a low-skill, low salary sector where you can employ a large number of people at very low rates and costs. And on the other hand, you have tourists coming from the wealthy parts of the world where often a beer will cost what a person in a developing country earns within a week. So you have these advantages, in inverted commas, that make tourism very interesting for some people to develop. And that then can obviously have various consequences. But as a general observation, I think that as soon as tourism is, the focus of development, all other development options are usually forgotten.
A lot of countries are working on tourist plans or tourist strategies aimed at getting as many arriving international tourists as possible, although there are a few destinations that are looking at value per visitor. What are the different strategies? What are the different options low-income destinations would have?
Well, it's two issues here. One is how many tourists you might attract to a destination and how much money they spend. And that is usually the focus. It's very simply speaking, most of the time, the number of international arrivals is taken as the indicator for development. The more, the better. It's as easy as that. And most people don't ask questions beyond that. Then you have some destinations that start to think about how much money is actually spent by a tourist, and then they take that as an indicator. They try to focus on those markets where you will have tourists that spend more money than those from other markets. And obviously that most of the time requires a more upscale infrastructure, because it's very simply the case that those people who are more wealthy, who would spend more money, would also like to spend in more luxurious accommodation, have a more luxurious holiday experience. And that has been the approach in many countries. I think what is never discussed is the question where the money ends up and which kind of development effects the money that is spent in an economy actually has. And in this regard, a backpacker who's staying in a small community, spending far less money than, say, a 5-star hotel visitor, can have a greater development impact and make a greater contribution to development than somebody in such an upscale hotel. The very reason being that money is injected directly into a local economy where people can make use of it, and where the money is going around in circles several times within a year. So in other words, you have so-called multiplier effects because of this type of tourism. And I think in the future we will have to discuss what money is really used, because it's not about tourist numbers, it's not about the total amount of money that is spent, it's about what the money actually does within a destination.
As highlighted by Professor Gößling, different forms of tourism have different development potentials. An investment policy focusing upon receiving a large number of high-paying customers might not necessarily benefit the communities living in areas where hotels are built. To protect the environment, benefit employment and income among the communities impacted by tourism, we have to develop a more sustainable form of tourism. I've asked Professor Gößling to define sustainable tourism and what is required.
I will give you the official definition, which always refers to 3 different dimensions of tourism. One, obviously, is the environment. Tourism that is sustainable shouldn't harm the environment, and there it gets fuzzy, because what meaning to hurt the environment or to change the environment has is very subjective, and there will be very different definitions in this regard, particularly since we are living in a world that's always been prone to change. Then we have social aspects of sustainable tourism, where we talk about business ethics, we talk about employment, we talk about labor conditions, this kind of aspect. And then we have usually the economic dimension, which I think is a bit more difficult to deal with, because it's about economic growth in the first place, or economic development, and it's a bit more difficult to say what that exactly implies. But to me, the most important part of that would be that the money is more evenly distributed within the economy.
Sustainable tourism is about ensuring that the communities benefit from the development and that the local environment remains healthy.